So the whole role of ideology in popular art is, or not really what the role is, what they are fundamentally, or what ideology is fundamentally. It's the propaganda or political messaging taking precedence over good, wholesome art. It's not to say you can't have political messaging in your art or in your stories or whatever the case may be, but the stories have to come first. The characters have to come first. The quality of your art has to come first alongside the political messaging or secondary. But if the messaging takes precedence, people are going to see it and they will disregard your art. If that's the role, if that's what you think all your art is going to do, all power to you. And you're free to do that, thank goodness, here in America. But your art will be more easily dismissed. So what we see with ideology is propaganda. It's simply propaganda as a form, as a function. And that form takes precedence over artistic form and artistic quality. But the problem is not that the ideology exists. That's actually not the problem. Ideology is free to exist in a country like this. The problem is it's an overwhelming force and influence, like Hollywood, Disney, Warner Brothers, Netflix, all these new streaming sites, all these major players in the entertainment industry, Amazon, Google, all of that. Well, the problem with that is these are monopolies, or at least Google and Amazon are monopolies. But Hollywood is the entertainment hegemon. And so they have direct control and power over circulation of entertainment. They say yes or they say no. And so if you want your art, being published or presented to the public square with a massive audience, people understandably look to those people first, those major studios first, to get their stories out there. And I'm speaking about American companies, but Europe has the same companies. We can compare and contrast, of course. And so that's the whole problem of ideology seeping into our entertainment and our art, is that it's just overwhelming. And a lot of people who are independent creators are snuffed out because we don't adhere to check boxes. We don't adhere to what they want. Ideology also has really affected stories. It's a little warm in here, and my headphones are kind of warm today. I don't know why. It's just been a warm day. Anyway, so you might see me just constantly adjust my headphones. But anyway, ideology is found in definitely stories we've seen, especially stories on screen, where stories are not fashioned in accordance to reality. The Fourth Age is a very well-known channel in this community, and he talks about stories and traditions just being sullied by this push, this narrative push. Well, the problem with ideology is, from whatever part of the spectrum you are, extremism does not adhere to reality. If you have a belief, no matter what reality says, you adhere to that belief and you work, whether mentally or physically or in a workforce, for instance, you bend that reality to your belief of what the world looks like, what the world holds for you. Well, what is that? Solipsism. And so if you have stories fashioned that go against reality, that's a form of extremism, of ideology. Examples that we have seen in the last decade, for sure, heroes have become villains, and elemental evil is seen as something to sympathize. And traditional heroism is either replaced or deconstructed. Actually, in the case of Star Wars: The Sequel Tragedy, Luke Skywalker is replaced and deconstructed at the same time by Rey. Rey replaces him, and he is reduced to a morally decrepit human being who just hides in a mountain. He's not the hero that we knew in the original series. So things like that, where heroism, which actually is fundamental in human law, in human nature, how we treat people, how we honor people, how we honor reality with heroism and truth. A recent example also has been the fundamental difference between men and women. This act of homogenization where we have to make women look blocky like men with levels of testosterone, and where men have been emasculated. Now, in my whole life, I've known two women who had a natural up of testosterone. It was just that was their chemistry. Nothing taken. That was just how they were built. That's just how they were designed, and they were active in the army, and they were physically very, very strong. But in my whole life, especially my adult life, I've only known two. Maybe my whole life I've known three. Yes, I've had one relative who is more that type. So three out of my whole life. That is a rarity. It's true and it exists, but to make a woman masculine, like we had seen with the Terminator franchise with Dark Fate, it just doesn't work. It's not the natural order of things. Now, with the emasculation of men in particular, this has been kind of, I would say this has been a trope for a number of years. You know, we could go all the way back to Hanna-Barbera with Fred Flintstone. Like he's kind of the average, blue collar worker, and he gets into trouble and Wilma harangues him and stuff like that. And he gets beaten over the head, and they're kind of silly like that. But that trope actually extended to sitcoms in the 90s where, men were usually frumpy looking. They were usually out of shape. They had to be corrected constantly by their gorgeous wives. They were always berated and reduced to like simpletons by their children. Like the children had to have all the, zingy lines or zingers. Yeah, zingers to reduce the men by, reduce their intellect, their intelligence, and also just their role as a good authority, as a father. Now, something like that, I think in the 90s, I don't really have a problem with. And I saw very wholesome sitcoms where the men could have comic relief, but they were also very serious roles too. And they were, good fathers, good older brothers, and all of that. So if there's a mix, then that's fine. But the reason why I would have a problem with it now, not just because it's an old tired trope, but because there's an actual malicious intent behind it. There's an actual intent to reduce men to something they are not. As an example, emasculation. I know this is fun stuff. This is lighthearted stuff, right? And I don't mean it to be too serious. I mean, these are just things that I have noticed in art. So that's ideology in the iconic popular art. The political messaging taking precedence over the actual storytelling, over the actual artistic creation and experience. So, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for me? Well, let's talk about the role of the independent artist, someone who is outside that circle, that major hegemon, that circle that is really the hegemon of Hollywood and all of that. Well, first of all, we have to produce art that is meaningful to us. Now, we may have a religious idea, we may have a political idea, and that's fine. We can use those ideas, but not at the expense of reducing the art in its standard of excellence. What is meaningful to us? Well, really, as a society or just a natural order of things, regarding human law, we should produce art that upholds traditional heroism, that upholds personal sacrifice, that upholds friendship and camaraderie, that upholds kindness to the elderly, to the orphan, to the widow, that upholds the traditional Judeo-Christian values, even if you're not religious, even if you're not a Christian, or if you're not Jewish, or any of that. We still have fundamental values that honors the well-being and the personhood of another. So upholding traditional heroism, I think, at least for me, I want to produce art that upholds beauty and aesthetics. I believe aesthetics is really key. It's not that you can't make ugly art, but don't call it beautiful. It's going to be intentionally ugly and that's okay. It's okay to see a fine line between beauty and ugly. I've mentioned this on my previous streams, but upholding beauty, upholding aesthetics, and it could be different shades of beauty. It could be different forms of aesthetics, and it could be experimental and esoteric and all of that great stuff. But what draws the human being? What draws what draws them by sight, by hearing, by all the senses? What draws them? I don't think a culinary artist can get away with making food that tastes awful. I just thought of that. So upholding beauty and aesthetics, upholding objective standards of excellence. Over the years, I've tended to see this entitlement among artists where if their art is called into question by the standards of excellence, they'll say, well, no, there's just a freedom of expression. It's just my way of expressing it. Well, you can express it any way you want. Is it done well? It's just a matter of truth. There are artists who make their art haphazardly. They probably, I've seen artists who make their art. I'm thinking, you have more knowledge than this. I've seen you have more skill than this. No, it's just a matter of self-expression. It's like, yeah, well, do it well. So upholding objective standards of excellence. If it's a poor drawing, if it's not sculpted well, if it's not composed well, if it's not a good film, people are going to put you to task and ask you to do better. And guess what? That's okay. That's okay. In fact, that's what's needed. I think also my role as an independent artist is upholding reality, upholding the natural laws of the physical world and the natural laws of human nature. So I can't really express this as well as someone who would draw or illustrate. Alan Lee with his concept art of Lord of the Rings, he knew how to draw elves beautifully. He knew how to draw woods and mountains beautifully and oceans. He knew how to draw the dwarves with a beautiful distinction, a beautiful culture about them. Now with music, how can I demonstrate the human beauty? Well, with music, I can't think of a better example right now than the human voice and how I could sing. How can I sing that would be compared to that which is ethereal or otherworldly or angelic versus someone who just happens to do something like the vocal fry. I said happens to do something like the vocal fry. if you didn't catch what I said, yeah, I mean that's cool. It can be used, but it's not beauty. Well, actually, vocal fry can make beautiful, but hearing a boys choir, like a world-class boys choir compared to this, there's something almost spiritual or that transcends us into something else when we hear a well-trained boys choir in Estonia, for instance. So the role, I think, for most independent artists is to have art be first. Art takes precedence. Messages, themes, ideas are all great, but they are secondary to art. You need to produce art for art's sake, almost more than for your sake. Now, for my sake, it's just because I love it and it brings me so much joy, composing music and writing. But, compose music for music's sake. Write a story for the sake of storytelling. Produce a film to make a good film. I think that has been lost of late. One thing that is tempting to do, I could see among artists who don't go for the propaganda, who don't go for the agenda, is to use their art as a way to spite the other side. So I would caution against using your art as a way to spite the other or the ideologue. That's actually going to be a natural resistance to them. But don't use art just for the sake of spiting the other side. it's not respectful, and it's really not functional. There's really no purpose to that. The other thing too is I would caution against using your art for activism. Even if there's something you believe is fundamentally wrong with an institution or government or a system or a religion or whatever the case may be, I wouldn't use art as activism. It really, the first thing is it gets stale. People forget. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry, artists out there. They forget. They do forget. What they remember is something bound in a piece of art that is timeless, that transcends their place in history, that transcends its place in history. So maybe it's made in the year 2030, but maybe you've made a piece of art in 2030 that goes for another 200 years, for as long as the cultures last or the civilization lasts and all that. So I would caution it. If it fulfills you, I mean, if you feel like that's your role, to use your art as a form of activism, all power to you, but it's going to be very short-lived. It's going to be very short-lived because who your audience really is actually no one you're trying to persuade. It's just people who are in your echo chamber. It really is. You want to produce art that's meaningful, and you want to produce art for art's sake, not for any function to go against someone else. Just do what you love. Now, as overwhelming as ideology is in our popular art and also in our academic art, we are living in a fantastic time. Now, I know you're like, what, guys? Just hear me out. Like, Michelle, it's 2020. This has been a really hard year for all of us. Yeah, that is true. But I want to go a little bit deeper with a message on hope. We have an incredible opportunity in this time of our time, the opportunity of our time. We live in an unprecedented time where technology is incredibly cheap. And so therefore you can produce some amazing films, some amazing games, some amazing art, some amazing stories in your own home because audio. I was thinking audio. Audio is one example because my name is Sound Engraver. Because technology has become very accessible, very powerful, and very cheap. It is not expensive to produce something mind-blowing. And you can do that at a very, very reasonable cost. All the music you hear and all the music you probably will continue hearing me produce over the years, at least for a while, probably for the next few years if I don't do something else, with my computer is about $1,100. And yeah, I pay a mastering artist, so I pay for his services. But I produce music with Logic Pro, a $99 interface, $49. Yeah, no, that was $99. MIDI keyboard, it's a microphone here for another $99, and a computer for less than $500. So you can do an extraordinary amount of art, amount of excellence. You can do an extraordinary amount of excellent art for very cheap. We didn't have this kind of technology 20 years back or 30 years back. There are people making film in their basements. It's awesome. It's so cool. So that is the opportunity of our time, where we have so much powerful technology at such low costs that it's not unreasonable to think you can produce an amazing product in your home. I think that's fantastic. Lastly, what artists should do. What should we do? Well, you can do your own thing. I'm not going to warn you or wag my finger at you if you don't adhere to these ideas. But for me, I choose to stay as independent as possible. So some of you guys know that I'm working on a space opera, and I think I'll finish the first installment by the end of the year. and it's a massive story. This thing, I don't know how long it's going to take to publish. But let's say, hypothetically, let's say the story picks up. Let's say people really do like the space opera. Well, what if it picked up to the point where it had enough traction to attract a major player in entertainment? The way I've seen studios behave these days, I would say no. I'd find someone else who cares about story, who cares about craft, even if it means a much smaller audience, because I couldn't handle my story, putting my story into the hands of people who would refashion it in their own ways, in their own ideology, in their own reality. What we also can do as independent artists is we can show the public square that there's entertainment out there that doesn't carry ideology. Again, you can have political messaging in a story or in a piece of music, but it cannot be first, cannot take precedence. The thing with ideology, it tends to reduce the quality of the art because it's so focused on the political messaging. And finally, I would say produce the art you enjoy. Don't feel obliged to mimic an artist or a genre because you may think it would give you a bigger audience. No, produce the art you love, produce the genre. Like I love experimental electronic music that's a little bit more upbeat, but also down tempo and ambient, and it's got an audience, slowly and steadily growing. Yeah, so that's what I think we should do as artists. It's just advice, but advice I'm taking myself. And now the significance of your art, the cultural significance of your art. See, you can have a cultural significance in your art without having ideology. And that is your art, if it gets picked up, it's naturally going to resist the deep-seated ideology in today's entertainment. Why? Because the ideologues, they like to bend reality to their fancy. So if they will see your art as a threat if it becomes well known, because your art, simply by existing, contradicts their ever-changing, emotionally charged realities. And you're probably going to get pushed back for doing something different. And I think we're ready for that.